I'm back with another episode of Semi Pro, this time with the man, the myth, the beast. It's Vince. And he joins me today to talk about his casting career, how he thinks about his casting style, where he thinks he might be going in the future, and of course to recap some of the moments that have been a bit more on the memorable side from his career so far. So I actually did want to start with the man, the myth, the beast. I wanted to talk about that Cold Zero moment on Mirage B site, because that is one of the lines. I think there's like the KRB clutch as well with pistols, and that was like on a train map against maybe VP a long time ago. But there's a few clips that are sort of career defining, almost legendary for any given play-by-play caster out there. And one of the things that I wanted to ask you about with this case is, and it is a while ago, so I'm totally fine if you want to answer this more broadly, but how do you put yourself into a position as a play-by-play caster to elevate those moments that are already very hype, but elevate them to another level? How would you say that you sort of tackle that particular challenge?
Yeah, it's a difficult one to answer because my thought process when casting has always been to go with the flow. Like I don't have specific lines or ideas that I want to say in a cast. I don't use any like notes. Obviously, I'm researching on the teams and all that good stuff. But when it comes to the actual play-by-play casting itself, I'm a big proponent of just letting the game take me wherever it will. It's like a roller coaster, and in the moment, that's just what came to my head. And I know it's not necessarily like the most in-depth answer, but that's always been my style with commentating. Is on any given time, one of the things that really appeals to casting for me is it's very emotionally charged. It's very spur of the moment. It's very honest and genuine, and that's always been my style. So if a game isn't necessarily living up to the hype, sometimes I'll reflect that in my casting. I think it's important to be honest. It's important to be open about what you're watching. I don't want to blow hot air at people's asses and tell them it's the greatest game of all time if it's not. And on the other side of that, if it's an amazing play, I want to make sure I come out of that feeling like I did it justice. It's not about me, it's about the play itself. And that's one of the few times when I've actually came away from a play and I've thought I did a decent job on that one. So that was just a spur of the moment thing. I think it was back in like 2016, 17, and it's probably the clip or the kind of like tagline that people most know from my casting.
So it's an appropriate opener, I suppose, then. One of the things that I have as a follow-up for that is, obviously you mentioned you want to be honest and you want to reflect what's actually happening in the game, in the cast. My concern, as just somebody who's playing both sides, as somebody who's playing devil's advocate here, is that the broadcaster might be like, oh, but we want you to hype it up even if it doesn't make any sense, because we want you to put on, like, you know, a good product for all the viewers. And so is there a point where, like, do you just have yourself at maybe a higher normal state of hype or normal state of sort of attentiveness when you're casting, and then you only elevate it from there if it deserves it? Or how do you sort of like balance those two? Because obviously you got to make the tournament organizer happy at the same time as you're making the fans happy.
Absolutely. No, you're there to do a job. And I think uh, the version of me away from casting is very relaxed and calm and not particularly loud, quite reserved, introverted, to be honest. Casting definitely is more of a persona. There's no doubt about that at all. And I think you raise a good point. Like everything's dialed up to 100. You know, like the me that sat there watching Counter Strike from my own chair at home is not the same that's sitting there in front of a crowd, in front of potentially hundreds of thousands of people watching online. And you're right, I have a job to do. So I do still need to inject enthusiasm, but I think there's different ways of doing it. You don't have to be loud. You don't have to be really energetic in your voice. You can talk about more intricate details, or you can get into conversations with your co-caster. You can build up the narrative in other ways rather than just screaming at the top of your lungs if the plays don't really deserve it. And I think that's an art within itself. That's a skill within itself that's very important to hone. Narrative is a huge part of casting. And if you don't have narrative, why the hell should people care?
Another thing that sort of comes to mind for me too is, you mentioned earlier you do some prep for the teams initially, but you're not necessarily taking notes in the middle of the cast. And this is an interesting point because a lot of the play-by-play casters, and I guess this is a bit of an aside, but we all understand in the CS scene that nobody's purely play-by-play. There's always going to be maybe a little bit of color where they step in and they give their opinion, or if there's some downtime and the color throws to the play-by-play and the play-by-play has to pick it up and not be casting something, they have got to have something to say that's maybe responding to a point that the color made or something to that effect. So given that you have to be equipped to say something, we'll say analytical, about the teams that you're casting at potentially any point based on how dynamic CS is, but also based on timeouts or tech pauses or anything like that. What kind of prep do you do? Is there something specifically that you like to focus on, or would you more describe it as just general sort of understanding what the team's makeup actually is?
Yeah, I go through a lot of demos. Statistics are also a big thing for me. I think statistics are maybe one of the aspects that are most obvious and commonplace for a play-by-play to drop in. You know, while you're building that narrative, you can drop in a couple of statistics to back that up. You know, talking about this team has this many wins over this other team on this specific map, and this is how they've done it. So you can build the narrative, and if the same starts to happen again, you're like, what is this other team done to prepare to try and counter these plays? We've seen this happen before. These are aspects that you can always bring back in by just having gone back and looking at history. Is it going to repeat itself again? This is interesting for me, and I think it's interesting for the audience, especially as one of the downsides of all this online casting right now and all the online games and tournaments meshing into one is there are so many repeat fixtures. And so you have to sometimes use that negative as a potential positive. I think that's an important aspect of it. In terms of the more color aspects, I completely agree. I don't think that you can have two roles that are absolutely defined as I will only ever play by play, and if I'm working with Dust or whoever else, they'll only ever color cast. That's not really feasible. That would be very robotic in its nature. If you instantly went out of the moment because Dust spoke for a little bit too long, and then suddenly, you know, he can't just cover that first kill or two. When it comes to the analysis, like I'll often just pick up on things that teams are also doing. If I see a cool play, if I see a bit of misdirection or a fake that I think is really interesting, I'll bring it up. And then Dust can expand on that. I won't completely steal his thunder in that respect because that's his wheelhouse. That's where he's strong. That's not my strong suit. So I think it's about playing to the strengths of your co-caster as much as it is about playing to your own strengths.
One of the other things that is sort of in this line as well is finding that balance where you can actually throw and have that little space to talk about. And that's sort of what speaks to a larger system. And I'm not sure how deeply people have thought about this more broadly speaking, or how much other casters have conceptualized it this way. So I'll pitch it to you and you can tell me how accurate it is, or if you've had a similar thoughts yourself. But I would think of it almost like, if we look to Henry G and Saticus, for example, those are two people who I've been studying lately, and they have this system going for them where Henry likes to sort of bounce between a bunch of topics in the round setup, so to speak, and then he'll throw ahead of action or maybe as action is happening, and that'll be the initial play-by-play. And because of the way that CS rounds tend to play out, there's almost always also a resultant setup where there's a retake coming, but there's time for Henry to step in and draw the viewer's attention to something, and then Matt will take over again, and they'll have the retake play-by-play itself. Then there'll be a round wrap-up, and they sort of start it all over again. It's almost cyclical in nature. So obviously, there's been other casters out there who have had a bit of a different look on this setup. It hasn't all been the same thing. But I'm curious as to whether or not that's something that you've observed in your own casting, or have you naturally evolved at or arrived at a different conclusion, a different system? What's something that's worked for you, generally speaking, if we are going to look super like high resolution zoomed out? What systems have worked for you in casting Counter-Strike?
I think the reason why I've been around for so long and I've casted with so many different people is because I'm capable of working with pretty much anyone. And I think an element of that is understanding cues from other people. Like I can read other people pretty well. And so I get a good understanding fairly fast when somebody is comfortable about what they're talking about, or if they want to interject, they want to add something, or they're done and they want to pass it over. What I've typically tried to do, having worked with, I think the only person I've not casted with is James Bardolph. That's like at the sort of top end of CS. I think I have pretty much everyone else. Is I just want to make the product as good as possible. It's not about me. And I think this is an element that other casters sometimes fall into that pitfall where they are so desperate to try and have their own hype moment or their own tagline. You know, when we started the show about the man, the myth, the beast, that kind of moment that they will almost desperately seek it. And I think that often leads to a subpar cast. For me, it's about building the overall product up. And if that means that I need to give more room because my co-caster is a better play-by-play than I am, or maybe I'm a better analyst than they are and they're pure play-by-play, then I'll just fit into that role. So it's hard for me to know, like, if there's that cyclical mentality that you just spoke of before. I would say with Dust, because I've casted a lot with him, obviously, over the last few years, I would say there are elements of that. You know, he wants to get his 2 cents in at the start of the round where less is going to happen, build up until there is an actual crescendo of the round when it comes to its conclusion, when, you know, the clutches come in or any of that kind of stuff. And one thing that we've worked on a lot, actually, is that at first, Dust would talk a lot. And he'd be the first to admit that, you know, he could go off on a few tangents, and sometimes he'd talk over the first 3 or 4 kills, and it would put me in an awkward position where I'd come into the round and everything had basically already happened. And as a play-by-play caster, I don't really have much to add, right? And I don't want to get into the analysis role and then we have it reversed where he's the play-by-play and I'm an analyst because then we're both playing to our weak suits. So I think one thing we've worked on a lot is getting that right balance and right mesh of both playing to our strengths and trying to do our best to cover up the weaknesses to make the overall product as good as possible. Sometimes it's not quite well ironed, but for the most part, I think we've got a pretty good a good click in effect now.
And of course, the counterpoint to the idea of working with so many different people, some people would say, "Oh, jack of all trades is a master of none." And as you just pointed out, the fact that you've had the years so far working with Dust, you've almost been able to develop or refine certain rough edges from the system that might be at play there. And so you have that experience where maybe you didn't before. But I want to ask you on the positive side of working with a bunch of different people. Were there ever cases where things just clicked? Like you came in, you were able to read them, and you felt like you immediately were casting at a high level as if this duo had been together already for some months or years. Was there ever any case that's like that, that's memorable, where you casted with somebody who you hadn't casted with previously or you hadn't casted with much previously, but somehow you guys were just able to make it work?
I think on some basis, I will always be very critical of myself, and I find it very hard to completely accept that I've done like a good job. I'm always trying to push myself a little bit further. Um, but I feel at the same time that I've clicked in different ways with every single person I've worked with to some degree. I don't think it's ever been a terrible cast. It may not have been great, but I don't think it's ever been terrible. The person I probably fit in the best with though straight away was maybe Moses. Jason's someone I get along with very, very well. He's a super welcoming, chill, like relaxed guy, and obviously a phenomenal talent. Going across to coaching was a big loss for the CS talent pool. There's no doubt about that at all. And I felt working with him like instantly, I was just at ease. Like I think he has the same mentality I do, that he just wants the broadcast to be as good as possible. And so there was a lot of giving and taking from both of us. And I think that just worked into a very seamless sort of transition to the extent that we worked at DreamHack Masters Malmo for the first time back in 2000, I think 16. And then we didn't cast again for another 2 or so years. And we came back and we did Odense when Pansy got food poisoning, I think it was, at like the previous DreamHack. So I came in super last second. And it was like we didn't spend any time apart. Same when I went to go cast at IEM Katowice with him at the major when Anders wasn't able to make it. I think his second child had just been born. So they drafted me in to go to IEM, and it was like, nothing had changed. So Jason for me was probably like the easiest to just fit in and work with because the guy is just so good at what he does, and he can do both. Like he's just as good at play-by-play as he is analyst. Like he can do everything. So coming into that duo, I knew that I was in safe hands. Like at no point did I ever feel like it could go south.
I believe the Katowice major was also the one where you and Moses were handling the show match, the Danger Zone show match as well. And I distinctly have this memory of Moses taking the opportunity to sort of big you up. He gassed you up at part way through, maybe at the opening of that show match. Can you talk a little bit about like, was there a position where maybe beforehand you had expressed that like there was a need for that, or was that just him reading that like you should be bigged up, you should be felt like you belong here in that sense? And what was the backstory behind that?
I think Jason knows I would be mortified at the idea of asking someone to do that for me.
Sure.
He's such a good guy. Like I don't want to get emotional talking about it, but it was the build up to that as well. Obviously, I was away for like 6 months, and I got to Katowice. The plan was to come back around summer, and then I was offered the major, and I'd have been a moron to turn it down. Right, like it's such a great opportunity. So I came back a little bit earlier, and I think he realized that I'd been through a lot, and it was just his way of like trying to just be a great guy, like a great friend. So that was a really special moment. I had no idea he was going to do it. I was kind of stunned. The Polish crowd was incredible, super supportive, and it was just a really special moment. And that's one of the moments that'll probably stick with me for the rest of my life. The whole major was a great experience, but that moment in particular was just, I don't know, it's just so warm and so genuine as well. Like another reason why Jason's a great guy, like one of the best guys in esports.
One of the other questions I have for you, and is a bit more broad and also targeting the community specifically. So you referenced the warm Polish crowd, so to speak. And sometimes when we go and turn our gaze towards the community of Counter-Strike online, we view them in a very uncharitable light. They kind of get a bad rap, and sometimes people would say it's deserved as well. So we'll leave that to one side for now. But the reason why I bring that up is because when we consider the Counter-Strike audience, the viewership, a lot of them are going to be a silent majority where they're just there to soak in the cast. They're soaking in the games. They're watching the games themselves and enjoying them. Maybe chatting with some friends. Before COVID, we had people going even into bars and like doing some watch parties from there and stuff, which was obviously a big step towards making CS a little bit more just accessible, because you could just walk into a bar and, oh yeah, there's this game on. That's cool. Let me take a look at this. And that's a sort of an access point, an entry point for a lot of people. So bearing all this in mind, do you think that the Counter-Strike community in general is, in a sense, a higher enough level of understanding their own game that you can actually speak to some of the more nuanced points when you're doing your casts? Is that something that it has actually held true, or would you prefer, generally speaking, to keep things not necessarily dumbed down, but entry, or more of like a lower level and entry level for people who might not know that much about Counter-Strike?
That's a really interesting question, because it's one that I know a lot of other casters like Anders have brought up in the past. I think around E-League, it was a case of trying to be a little bit more broad, a bit more general, because there was a newer viewer base coming in. And as you said, like it really does link in with what you just mentioned. There was a lot of these like bar viewings with E-League. It was put on a lot of American, on the Turner broadcasting, and it went across to a bunch of different bars and all kinds of stuff. So I think they knew having a new viewer base meant that they had to be a bit more accommodating, and they couldn't speak about all the super fine and intricate details. So I think there is an element of that. The thing is with Counter-Strike, the reason I think it is the greatest esports in the world by far is because on a base level, it's very easy to understand. It's like if you watch football, like soccer, if you're American, you watch football, two teams of 5, 2 bomb sites, 1 attack, 1 defend. That's like the base level. You can understand it's very visceral. Player dies, you see it. 1 player disappears from the sidebars. You rinse and repeat. First to 16 wins. But then the great part about Counter-Strike is all the intricate details that fall below those layers. Like there's an easy base layer, and then you have multiple layers below that. You can really get deep. You can go down a rabbit hole with CS. And so I think it's important to keep it somewhat general, but also don't treat the audience like they're stupid as well, and try and teach them a few things. You can keep it fairly general with the casting itself, and then allow the analyst desk to break things down a little bit more. And then it gives the audience the choice. Do they want to stick around and learn more about the game, or do they want their sort of popcorn action and then to go to the bathroom or take a break, whatever, and come back for map 2? I think there definitely is a fair sense of going either or. For me personally, I think what's best for me is to try and walk the line between beginner and intermediate. That's where I try and keep my casting. And then Dust sometimes can take my point and expand on it in a way that makes sense. And that in itself is also a skill that he's really honed in on a lot over this last couple of years. Sometimes it's still too complicated, and I think we need to dial it back. That's an ever-going sort of ebb and flow and a back and forth. But for me, it's more intermediate, so that you're kind of capturing both audiences. You're capturing the newbies, and you're also capturing some of the more advanced people. And this is kind of goes back to an earlier question that you asked me with the analysis portion. Sometimes if I notice something really cool that's maybe more advanced and that isn't as often, I'll try and bring it in a way that makes sense. And it's prescient to a point that I've just highlighted before. So I'll try and capture the two together. Obviously, it's not something you can crowbar, because you're not always going to see those cool things. It might only happen once every tournament, once every couple of tournaments. But I think it's important to keep an eye open for these kind of things.
And one of the other things that's sort of contributing to this as well is that you have to have the mind space almost. Like you have to have the space to sort of think about all of these things and also catch the details in the first place, which if there's a hype moment going on, you might be too dialed into, you might not be able to catch the minimap to see a rotation, or you might not even be able to see how some player managed to get to a surprising position, and you need a replay for that or something to that effect. So I wanted to ask a little bit about sort of, and again, this might be a little bit too in the weeds for some people, but I am curious personally. How do you actually decide what to focus on in a round? Is there like a common ground every single time when you're doing a play-by-play of say a gun round, and you see like it's Mirage A site, it's going to be an exec? Have you developed like this habit of always looking to the same areas, generally speaking, or is it more like you have to go with the flow, like you said at one of the earlier questions?
That's another really good question. I think for me personally, it's become instinctual. I've been casting for so long, and a lot of the play-by-play sort of loops can be transitioned from game to game. I did Call of Duty before CS. I did League of Legends. I've done a lot of different games. I've done previous iterations of CS, and I think you're looking at certain hotspots on the map, or you're determining what is a potential narrative point to follow. Like, for example, if it's an eco round and you've built up this narrative, they have the raid boss, they have that 1 AK on the T half, focus on that. And if something else happens, you have to be open-minded enough and not stubborn to just stay on that point, but actually to switch. You're going to be wrong. Like, you're human at the end of the day. I've said plenty of wrong stuff. I said plenty of stuff that I have to correct. And that's fine. That's completely fine. You have to be open-minded, but I think there definitely are certain points in rounds where you have to be very cognizant of what a team's win conditions are and to follow them through. So again, if you have the raid boss, if maybe there's an AWP and that particular AWPer is absolutely cracking off and he's got 20 kills in the first 10 rounds, these are things that you should be focusing on. Or, to play devil's advocate, focusing on what the other team is going to do to shut that down. And if that doesn't come to fruition, fair enough. You just move on to the next thing. And it's like this priority list, I suppose. But I couldn't give you the exact list of what I'd be looking for, to be honest. That's a very interesting point that I'd have to go back and reflect on, because I think it is instinctual to a degree. It's just rinsing, repeating, having so many reps of casting for such a long time that there are just certain times in rounds where I kind of know what's going to happen because I've just seen it happen so many times in the past. And that's something you can't really teach. It just kind of happens over a period of time.
Well, it's one of the other points of casting in general is that when you do it for enough times, you actually start to see these patterns, even if it's only instinctual, like you were saying, right? Because sometimes the round does play out exactly like, 10 other rounds you've seen already or 1,000 other rounds you've seen already. And one of the other questions I have for you that's on this line is, we talked earlier about maintaining a certain level of hype or enthusiasm, despite the fact that maybe the game isn't going to be the most exciting on its face. When it comes to a game that maybe is playing out exactly the same, and maybe this doesn't ever happen, which is another thing you might be able to speak to, but if there's a game that plays exactly like another game that you've already casted, essentially there's always going to be some challenges on the job in terms of maintaining enthusiasm in that sense. What do you look to keep yourself invested into a game that's like that, or a round that's like that, where you kind of already know what's going to happen? Maybe it's even played out like another round in the same game that just happened a couple of rounds ago. How do you sort of tackle it from a different angle to keep the audience interested and also keep yourself interested?
I think it really helps that first and foremost, I'm just a fan of Counter-Strike. So even if I've seen a round play out thousands of times, I'm still excited for that what if. And that's the thing that I cling to a lot. I think optimism as a play-by-play caster is really important. You can't be too optimistic, though. You can't fake, that hype. You can't fake that genuine response. But I don't think leaving the door open is necessarily a bad thing, even if it's like a 1v4. If I left the door closed and I closed it fully on the coldzera clutch, I wouldn't have been able to ramp up to that crescendo point of where it all kicks off and it kind of came seamlessly. If I just said, oh, it's over, it's done, see you later, and then suddenly pulls off the clutch, and I'm like, wait, what the hell? Like, Jesus Christ, it wouldn't have had the same impact because that optimism wouldn't have been there. And I think optimism is such a key point. It's like that hope, the hope of what could be. And remembering that maybe 50% of the audience watching, it has hope too. They're a supporter of that team or that player. They want to see them succeed. You have to build into that. That's my job. You can have the color caster or your co-caster that's maybe good cop, bad cop kind of routine where the other person is a little bit more pessimistic or realistic. I don't think that's a problem either. To have the voice of reason sometimes if I ever step out of line and I'm just outrageous with how optimistic I am, I want to be called out. That's interesting in itself. But I think having optimism is so key. And I can honestly say that some matches aren't great, absolutely, but I have never felt bored commentating CS. Not once. I really enjoy it. I might be tired. I might be run down. I might not be able to focus 100%, but I still love this game as much, if not more so, than I did when I first played it back in beta, however many years ago that was. And that's not an issue for me personally. I've never struggled with that.
One of the things that I want to ask you about now is other games and how they compare to Counter-Strike in terms of your tenure casting them. So you referenced earlier you've casted some COD, you've casted some League of Legends. People should know that at this point you've also been doing a bit of casting in Valorant. And we can go as specific or as broad as we like here, but in general, I wanted to ask because some of the things you're saying, the fans are rooting for their own team. There's a potential for a hero miraculous play to come out. Some of those things are still accurate when you go to any of these games that we've just named. But obviously, like you said, you already have this opinion that Counter-Strike is the greatest esport. It's the most fun game to cast. So I wanted to go into a little bit why that is. We've sort of touched on this in terms of what you actually prefer or what you like about it, because like you said earlier, it's super easy to understand. So like the really crucial elements are in some ways obvious, but that it makes it even more exciting to see how it could change. Aside from the more mechanical side of things, like what about Counter-Strike really speaks to you as the greatest esports to cast as well as the greatest esport to watch?
I think that unraveling process of the simplicity into something very intricate and interesting. I think also how fast paced it can be. You can have slower rounds, which actually I'm completely on board with. I don't mind casting slow rounds at all because it allows you to build that narrative and to have a bit of a break. If everything's always at 100%, you have nowhere to go from there, and that's an issue that I notice a lot of sort of less experienced casters fall into. They come into a round and they just go 0 to 100, and then if the play gets even better, they have nowhere to really go, and it's like you've reached your limit, you've reached your high point already, and that's very noticeable from a neutral's perspective. So I think what's great about Counter-Strike is you have these mixed match rounds where things do slow down. It's a very visual, simple game as well in the respect that you know gun shoots head, player dies. You know, there's not too much to learn. Like in League of Legends, you got tons of abilities,
Yes.
and you got summoner spells, and what does this dragon buff do, and what does red do, and what does CS? I was like, Jesus Christ, there's just so much going on. And if you're a League of Legends player, that's great, you know everything. But if you're a newcomer, it's very, very alienating. I want to get into Dota 2. I have no idea what the hell's going on, right? And I play a lot of League, and I still have no idea because the game is just outrageously in depth. I think another aspect is that CS just has so much history behind it. This is a franchise that's been going on for decades. And some of these players that are still playing to this day have been playing since 1.6. The likes of Forest, for example, you know? So you can build a lot of narrative going back decades with certain teams. And I just think it's a game that it's easy to leave at the door. You don't have to dwell on it too much. But whenever I come back to CS, no matter how much time I've put into playing it, casting it, watching demos, I always have that fresh feeling with it. And maybe that's just an element of the unexplained. Everything just seems to click perfectly with Counter-Strike with me. And I can still enjoy other esports titles. I can still enjoy League of Legends and Valorant and even COD, like going back to COD 2, COD 4. But for me, they've never really come close to Counter-Strike. It just has that X factor that's hard to put your finger on.
Now, this question is going to sound a little bit blasphemous, especially after you've had all those glowing words for Counter-Strike. But I have a feeling that maybe there's been something just down the history that you've noticed about Counter-Strike that if it were changed, maybe the game itself would actually suffer, or the competitive integrity of the game would be thrown into question or something to that effect. But just purely hypothetically, if there was something that you could change or some change that would be made that would make the game even more exciting to cast or make your job as a caster even more, like you could go deeper with it. You could do something a little bit differently. Bit of a different headspace because we're not talking about changes that would objectively make the game better for pros to play necessarily. But has there been anything that's occurred to you? Like some people have said, pistol rounds, just get rid of them. And maybe that would destabilize a lot of the game, but maybe it would also make the game better to cast. What do you make of some of these other suggestions? And if anything, it comes to mind on this particular question.
I think the game in itself right now is pretty spot on. I think it's human nature to look for problems that aren't necessarily there. Like we get, let's be honest, as a species, we get ourselves into plenty of issues for that reason alone. And I think with CS, it's the same. Like we should be more grateful for how great the game is. That being said, though, I would like to see some mix-ups with maps. If I'm being honest, I'd like to see a couple other maps come into the pool. I don't know about you. I'm tired of Dust 2 at this point. I think Mirage maybe needs a little bit of a tweak as well. I understand a lot of people still like the map, and I think strategically it's still very versatile and it can be great. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying it's trash by any stretch of the imagination, but Dust 2 in particular for me is a bit stale. And so I would not be opposed to the idea of bringing in another map, whatever it is. I'm not sure what it would be right now. You've got Cobblestone, maps like that on the back burner. Sure, the latest version was absolutely awful. But if they can fix Cobblestone, I used to love that map back in the day. I think that would just keep it a little bit more fresh. Just have maybe seasonal changes where certain maps come in and out. And I understand that would put more of a stress and workload on the players and the teams. But at the same time, I think it would really reinvigorate Counter-Strike as a whole. So for me, I'd be more focused on the maps than the actual in-game kind of elements themselves. I think that's pretty spot on. I can see people's issues with the economy. The fact that you can force out Galils in the second round after a bomb plant is pretty unreasonable from a teaser's perspective. I do agree with that. But it also makes it quite exciting because at no point do you have these vast sort of minutes back to back, where one team basically just has to double eco and they're two gimme rounds. I like the fact that actually there are banana peels all over the place with Counter-Strike currently on both sides of the coin. That makes it exciting. I do understand though, and I can see it from the perspective of those that don't enjoy that, but I would always focus towards the maps. I think that's where the real issue is.
So one of the things that obviously changing the maps would accomplish as well is giving a bit of a new look, or instead of changing something fundamental about how the game is played, you're actually just changing the environment, the battleground, so to speak. And that obviously can speak to different tactical adaptations that could happen. There's like a whole different rabbit hole that we could go down as to like which maps could be like super good for competitive play, even in their current form. Now, one of the things that this ties into is if we look to Valorant, obviously there's way more changes in Valorant if you're just going from CS to Valorant, but one of the things that I've noticed is that even so early into that game's career, people have already hated new maps. Icebox came out and people are dodging that left and right. They're saying like, I just Alt F4 in the middle of this map's loading screen, stuff like that. So this is a situation where it's a bit of a different kind of question, given that it is a bit more Valorant focused. But I'm curious as to your thoughts as to some of like the good things that Valorant has introduced that might even be able to be backported into CS in that way, and maybe some of the other things that maybe pitfalls to avoid. Anything that you've sort of seen from Valorant so far that you're like, if Valve were considering adding this, it would either be really good or really bad.
So the interesting crossover question is that obviously CS doesn't have abilities, and although you do have smokes and molotovs and these kinds of things, Valorant obviously is taking that idea and just cramming it to 100. So I think some maps that may transition across pretty well from one game to the other, you always have to, like on a super base level, like mechanical level, you then have to put into the equation that there's abilities that can drastically change the dynamic of how the game works. You have like teleportations,
Yes.
you have all kinds of mad stuff going on. So that does definitely throw a wrench in the works. I think the only thing that really springs to my mind that could maybe work from Valorant to CS is lowering the round amounts a bit lower. So instead of it being first to 16, maybe it could mirror a little bit more on Valorant side of things and make games a little bit shorter and sweeter. That could be an interesting dynamic. I don't know how that would affect the economy, though, with round loss bonus and all those kinds of things. I'm certainly not smart enough to figure out on the fly. So I do wonder if that would have an impact. As I said, I think mechanically, CS is honestly in a really good place. I really wouldn't want to change too much. I think sure, some weapons have taken a long time to get nerfed, the Orc, the Krieg, of course, but they've now been put in their place. I, I couldn't really think of anything else, to be honest with you. I think CS is in a really, really good spot.
Well, if we move on to some of those other games that you have casted, I have just a brief question in general about like where you think some of these will be heading. Obviously, I'm not super aware of whether or not you've been casting like any of these other COD games or League of Legends, for example, recently. But given the fact that you've obviously recently been tracking Valorant a little bit, any thoughts so far on where it's headed, and do you think that it also could be like a sort of living alongside Counter-Strike as opposed to what everybody's saying, either it's going to kill Counter-Strike or it'll die itself? Like, what's your perspective on that whole thing, and do you think Valorant will still be like an attractive option for broadcast talent and players going forward in the next couple of years?
The interesting thing for me about Valorant will be what happens when Riot fully gets involved with it. Do they take it more of an LCS route, or do we have this situation where they do allow other tournaments to come in and have sort of their third-party tournaments, but accepted from Riot's perspective? Because I was back there when League of Legends was going full swing. I used to do the Challenger series before Riot picked it up, and there was a lot of work for me. Then Riot took over, and basically all that work dried up overnight. It was gone. So I'm curious if Riot does something similar with Valorant, if they have any plans to fully take over the whole sort of project. I would assume they probably will to a degree. But I think in terms of coexisting, absolutely will. I've been on that page since day one. I never thought Valorant would kill CS. I enjoy both games. I think they can coexist, no problems. I think Valorant can be its own entity. You know, if people want to go across and play that, and I actually think it's kind of a good thing for Counter-Strike, because some people starting Valorant, it's a gateway to Counter-Strike. If they're not on board with all the abilities, they're not on board with the more cartoony graphics, well, listen, we got the serious game over here. Go play that instead. I think it can actually be a good thing, which is mutually kind of beneficial for both games. I realize that, again, that's maybe the optimism shining through, but that's the way I look at it. I never saw Valorant as the CS killer. Now, the NA scene may disagree with that, but I think the NA scene had more than enough of its own issues to start off with before Valorant was even a thing. And so I think they can both coexist. I think once Riot gets involved from a broadcast talent's perspective, things could drastically change, which could definitely dry up a lot of the opportunities unless you're willing to go across there and work full time. And I think some of the casters that are dabbling in Valorant right now, once that becomes sort of the forefront, if it does, they may have to backtrack a little bit.
Well, this segues nicely into the next point as well, because something that Valorant has reignited a little bit is that sort of community-born narrative, but maybe there's some truth to it. We don't really know it from the outside perspective of casters, specifically maybe up-and-comer casters or tier 2 casters, tier 3 casters, being viciously competitive, undercutting people, taking lower rates, doing, crazy things in general. And this is something that where I've heard plenty of tales from the CS scene, obviously just more or less rumors, unless they were spoken by somebody who I can take their word as gospel in that sense. But given that we don't have a complete picture of what's going on, would you say that, and maybe this is something you can't answer specifically to Valorant, but maybe more specifically to CS, would you say that the community narrative of the casters being overly competitive with one another, maybe especially at a lower tier, is it like dog eat dog in that scenario? Is that real, or would you say that that's kind of overblown?
There's definitely elements of truth to it. There's a lot of politics in esports, as with most aspects of life. But I think because it's such a desirable job, it sometimes brings the worst out in people. A lot of people that get into esports have very big personalities and are not scared of showing it. So that also compounds the issue as well. I can say firsthand, I've experienced plenty of these. I'll say I'm in a strange position where I'm not. I always find like the tier system a strange one. Like I never really can fully justify who's tier 1, who's tier 2, etc. For me, it's like the people doing all the tier 1 events are tier 1, and even if your skill set is better than like just working tier 2 events, I think you're probably still there or like a 1.5. So I feel like I'm more established than trying to fight, for the scraps at the very bottom. But I have been in there in the past. But esports was in a drastically different position when I was down there. Like I worked for the first 5 years and basically never got paid because there was no money in it at all. I just did it as a hobby, just as a bit of fun. And maybe we'd get like 500 viewers maximum, and that was considered loads of people, right? And so I really, worked up from the ground level to today. So there are elements where I still notice it to this day, but I'd imagine other people have horror stories. I don't doubt it for a second. It may be overblown, as most things are. It may not be as rife or as commonplace as some people in the community may make it out to be, but it definitely happens. There's no doubt about that at all.
And this sort of gets worse when we consider that one thing that we learned last year, I believe, was that most tournament organizers, and this is like, if it's the majority, then it's kind of mind blowing considering the position we were at before COVID actually hit. So maybe this was like early 2020, late 2019, where we heard that most tournament organizers are paying like not 3 months in, like 90 days late almost from the point of view working. So you're putting this tier 1 broadcast up, and you're putting this product out there, you're doing this service, and you don't get your money for 90 days after, in some cases, maybe in most cases even. And this happened even worse when StarLadder bungled their own deal with the Berlin Major itself. So that was a case where we had a major tournament organizer, literally for a major event, doing the same thing, maybe even going longer than 90 days. And this is obviously a bit of a potentially rocky ground, but I wanted to get your thoughts on how the TOs might be able to just change their business model. And also, if you want to touch on the broadcast talent that might be doing some of this undercutting stuff and might be conceptualizing it more like a dog eat dog world, what they might be able to do to maybe not professionalize the scene at a lower level, but in general, just make the scene more palatable to competition that's on the friendlier side as opposed to on like the dog eat dog side. So what's your take so far, and specifically starting with the TOs? How did that actually happen, and where can we go from there?
Yeah, so I was one of the people that got paid, I want to say 2 or 3 months late. And obviously, the issue is that, especially if you're pursuing freelancing as a full-time thing, you have bills to pay, you have mortgage, rent, whatever it may be, putting food on the table. And if a company pays you 90 plus days late, and I also know that some people got it way worse than me with other companies, then in some cases you have to borrow money. You're on your last few pennies and cents, and you just don't know when that payment's coming, and you're desperately hounding the company, like you're spamming them with emails like, come on, I need to pay my rent. Then of course in the back of your mind you're worried, if you push too hard, does that burn that bridge? You never get to work with them again. That's one massive source of income, especially if you're a lower down talent that's not getting offered everything. Is that your career basically done? Can you speak out publicly about this? If you do, you're not burn. That bridge is completely burnt. I've done this a couple of times and I never got contacted by the companies again. So I can tell you from firsthand experience that does happen. So it's brutal. I will also say though that what happened was so key, and I would definitely like to highlight people like Henry and Moses as well. Richard, obviously, and Thorin. These are all big community figures that have spoke out about this, and that's a key aspect of getting it done. I think that put a lot of pressure and a lot of weight on these companies to get their shit sorted out and to get those payments out as soon as possible because their reputation was going down so quickly. I know Dust has also dealt with this as well in Valorant with I think it's Pulse.
Yes.
So it's something that happens in a lot of different companies, a lot of different games. It's not CS exclusive. There is another element though in terms of like the whole talent undercutting thing. I do also want to give some people a benefit of the doubt, and I know this firsthand. When I was coming up through the ranks, it's very hard to figure out what you're worth. And so I do believe that a lot of people undercut actually by accident. I think that they don't value themselves as highly as they should. They go into a tournament and probably ask for like half the pay that they could without knowing it. And again, going back to what I just said before, if it's one of your first opportunities with this company, you don't want to go in there and ask for double or triple how much you're worth, because then that might be held against you. You know, that company might think, geez, this guy's greedy. You'll never offer him a job again. So there is definitely an element of that. And I think that sometimes probably happens and it gets lost sort of in all the whispers, and people start to maybe twist that negatively. I think so many people are jaded in esports, and I fully understand it, having been around here for well over 10 years. I understand that cynicism, but sometimes it's best to maybe try to look at things as optimistically as possible and give people the benefit of the doubt, because that jaded outlook can often actually make a bad situation so much worse.
Well, that's another component too, is that we even conceptualize, even in the way that I phrased the question there, I was guilty of it as well. The idea of the TO as this monolithic entity, when in reality, you're probably dealing with talent managers who are real people and have their own careers and things to worry about. So obviously there is like a lack of human connection in the way that this has been framed publicly. Like even when Thorin and Richard Lewis talk about it on By the Numbers, they almost conceptualize it as the TOs being these puppet masters playing the casters against one another, and sort of like trying to benefit from the fact that there is undercutting or there is this competitive stuff. So bearing that in mind, have there been strategies that have worked for you to sort of get past some of these issues when you're talking specifically to the talent managers or some of the people at these tournament organizers? Have there been ways for you to see past it without having to pull that the nuclear option, so to speak, of going public and tweeting at them all the time, or essentially shedding some more public light on everything? What have been the ways for you to get around that when you haven't had to go public?
I would say I've always been fairly straightforward and quite blunt. Like before getting into casting, I worked a bunch of really, really shitty jobs. And so I'm really appreciative of what I have. But I'm also not scared to go back there if I have to. And so I've always been very direct with people in this regard. Sometimes I have burnt bridges as a result of it. Like there's no doubting that at all. But I've always been pretty straightforward. I think that's the best policy. And typically, I've not had any issues. And I think a big part of that is because I've been so straightforward. It's not to say I've never had issues. Of course, I have, like StarLadder. There's been other companies as well. But I think being direct with them. I will also say, though, that there definitely is a component to some of the orgs and companies. I don't know who the exact people are, but there are definitely elements of playing talent off against each other. That absolutely happens. Absolutely does. I don't want to be naive either by saying, well, we'll just give everyone the benefit of the doubt all the time. I think there obviously is a time when you have to realize, like, not to be too naive. And that's a thin line between optimism and naivety. Definitely the case in esports. And a lot of people will make the most of that and they'll exploit that weakness if you allow them to. And that's why I've wanted to be as direct and straightforward with talent managers as I possibly can. If I am unhappy with something, I'll tell them, not in a way that is degrading or trying to, I don't know, like insult them, but I'll be direct about it. I'll just say, look, this isn't on. This needs to switch, or this needs to change. My payment's like 2 weeks late. What's going on? Like, I need to know what's happening here. I've got bills to pay. And I didn't want to come out publicly and talk about StarLadder because I didn't want to burn that bridge. I was in no position. I'm still not. It's not as if I'm getting hired off every single company out there. It's mainly only DreamHack that's hiring me time and time again, which I'm very grateful for. But what I noticed is that a lot of people were calling Richard a liar and calling him out publicly because he couldn't say who his sources were. And that's the only reason why I tweeted it out publicly and said, like, listen, one of his sources was me. Because like Richard's a good guy, and he's looked after me a lot, and he's really looked out for me a lot. So I didn't want to leave him hanging like that. But for the most part, I probably wouldn't go nuclear unless I was absolutely backed into a corner. I was literally like, rent was due, or I couldn't put food on the table. And it was like my last resort. I think it's like how a lot of freelancers think. And I'm in a really lucky position. I get to do this full time. And although I'm not working every single event with every company, I'm doing all right for myself with my streaming with casting. So if I miss a payment a little bit late, that's all right. But for the other people, they don't have that luxury.
One of the things that you mentioned there is that you do try to carry yourself in that blunt manner where you're just straightforward and honest, and you give it to him like it is. And I'm going to leverage that here for this next question because it's going to be about Dust. This is just a point of personal curiosity, and I've seen a lot of people who seem to have like the same thought process when they interact with Dust on Twitter or something to that effect, where they'll say, why aren't you being hired at all of these other events? Like, clearly your broadcast skills have massively improved over the last year or so. And you've accepted jobs where maybe there was almost like no advance warning, like the Flashpoint 2 closed qualifiers where you and him casted together. So people seem to be puzzled, myself included, as to why Dust isn't getting hired to more events. I'm not sure how much you want to go into the specifics or how much you can even really say. Maybe some of the stuff is not your purview, but is there a reason why? For example, you have been sort of mixed and matched with like Tom Biz recently and at the DreamHack events, where Dust has sort of left by the wayside.
Well, I hate him. No,
Yeah.
obviously, no. It's a case that, to be completely honest, I'll be open about this, and I think Dust wouldn't be too bothered by this either. The only company that was hiring both of us together was DreamHack, and they made it clear to us that they didn't really see us as being a great duo together. I'll give DreamHack a lot of credit for this. They actually spent the time to send a proper email out to both of us and give us feedback. No other company's ever done that for me individually or me with another duo. And so I'll always respect that a great deal. They went out of their way to do that for us. And it was mainly about the fact that, listen, if they want to make somebody like the face of their company, they didn't really like see it being me and him getting hired week in, week out, tournament in, tournament out. And I can't really hold that against them. I think the issue that Dust and I have is, again, just being completely honest, neither of us are the most charismatic people. Neither of us are massive showmen. We don't have like this huge camera presence. It's something I still struggle with, however many years later. I know he's the same. I think mechanically and in terms of understanding what we're talking about, we're solid. But it's that other stuff. It's that content side, maybe, that you couldn't necessarily push us both and say, like, these guys are the finished article. I don't think we are. I think there's a lot of things we need to work on. So even though I personally think that our duo is pretty damn good, and given enough space and enough time, we can make it even better. At the end of the day, we're not owed anything from DreamHack, or any other company for that matter. And everything we get is a luxury. It's a bonus. As I said, I'm just super appreciative for working in esports at all. So I think realistically, Valorant is probably the only way forward for both of us together, because it's not like the other companies are knocking our door down and saying like we absolutely have to hire these two for all of our events. So I think Valorant is probably where you'll see Dust and I. I obviously need to pay the bills, so I'll work where I can and with whoever DreamHack, because ultimately they're my boss. So I do what they say when they're hiring me. And you probably see us and Valorant. We were supposed to do some stuff earlier this month, but I got sick, so I had to pull out. Hopefully we'll get another chance like in about a week's time or so. I know there's something else around the corner. But in terms of CS, if we get offered something, I'm sure we'll bite the hand off. I will definitely take it. But I just don't think companies look at the two of us together and think like this is an absolute, tier one duo. And fair enough. Like I can't necessarily say that they're wrong. I do think that we've been maybe judged a bit too harshly. We haven't had a great deal of events together in this last year to prove ourselves. And I think we have improved tremendously. And people are still basing us off like 2017 or whatever. But I understand it. It's fair enough.
Well, that last point is exactly where I want to go with this next one, because it ties back neatly into the commentators who are undercutting or doing this, like, shady stuff, and they've almost like the community perception is that there's jaded people in esports that look at the tier 1 talent and they're like, if I could just have those opportunities, man, I would knock it out of the park. And to some extent that's like an admirable trait as well, and something similar I think could potentially have happened with you and Dust it had you guys had those opportunities. So more broadly speaking, and it may be removing yourself from the equation as well, but feel free, obviously, to think about how you've slot into this sort of example. Would you conceptualize it on it? Like, do you think it's like an honest and correct interpretation to say that once you hit a certain level of being hired consistently at tier 1 events, that the fact that you were hired at the last tier 1 event is more of a guarantee of your next tier 1 hire than your ability to cast and produce a high, quality product? Is that like a fair assumption to make from somebody coming from the outside?
Absolutely. I think that's a very fair assumption. I think it's maybe a bit harsh to the casters to suggest that they don't necessarily have the skill level to maintain that level. But I think if you're hired for tier 1 events and people by and large accept you and you do a good job, you're more likely to keep getting hired, especially if you're easy to work with. Like a lot of these people that do the hiring, I'm not saying they don't know anything about casting or CS, because they obviously do, but I don't think that they're as vigilant with checking out all of the craft and all the elements of casting as someone like I would be, because it's my job. I think I would notice a lot more of those intricate details more so than someone hiring. They've got other things to do. They've got so many jobs to do. Like often these talent managers have 3 or 4 other jobs at the same time. Like they're juggling a really crazy workload. But I think that's a fair assessment, really. I think that's why you get typically the same people going to most of the same tournaments week in, week out. And it's because they do a good job. Like they're good at their job. It does make it difficult for that next sort of batch of casters to break through. It does make it into an awkward sort of spot where, for me, for example, I got a lot of my opportunities because someone else couldn't make it to the event, whether it was through illness or whether it was through family emergencies. But I also think that, being completely honest, it's not that Dust and I, in our particular case, didn't get opportunities. I think we did. I just don't think we did a good enough job for that first year or two to turn enough heads and make people think like we have to get these guys in. I think that we could have done better. And it's easy to kind of excuse it as, oh, we just didn't get enough chances, like all these brass rings, and we were always, trying to reach for them. There were opportunities. And sometimes you have to reflect and you have to realize that you just didn't do good enough. Some of it's out of your hands, obviously. There is an element of luck involved, but there's also a lot of, I would say, networking and social elements of casting. This will sound like it's sort of being bitter, but it really isn't. I think ability level actually probably falls underneath something like networking ability when it comes to getting hired. I think that's a crucial element of it. Now, that's not to say that if you're a great networker but a trash caster, you'll still get hired to tier 1 events. Obviously not. But I think you'd be a little bit naive if you looked at the networking element of commentating and didn't see the importance of it. And this is something I have been truly terrible with. And I'll hold my hands up. I've been awful with that aspect. Like, I'm not naturally someone that mingles a lot, goes to after parties or any of that stuff. And I feel I could have done so much better with those elements and got closer to a lot of my fellow talent and kind of become closer friends. And that would have had a big sort of positive impact. But again, it's not as if it's like an old boys club of, if you're not part of this friend group, you won't get hired. Like, that's not the case either. Definitely doesn't hurt, though.
Well, that's one of the next points that I actually wanted to bring up here, because you were just saying, you're not necessarily like just naturally geared towards the more social mingling aspect. I think you said this, excuse me, at the beginning of the interview, that you were somebody who's like almost a bit more on the introverted side naturally when you're not doing the casting, right? When you're not on the broadcast, and you almost have to like rise to the occasion in a way to say, oh, there's Counter-Strike on and I'm going to be the one who's the voice of it. Okay, now I can get enthused. Now I can get amped up. One of the things that's been really appreciative when I go and watch, for example, some of your streams or some of your YouTube content is you definitely seem like just like salt of the earth, down to earth guy, right? That's almost like what people would describe you as, is like, oh, that's Vince. Like, that's my buddy. I could go into a bar and have a drink with him in another time when I lived down the street or whatever, and we were friends, right? So that's like almost a thought process that I think a lot of your viewers engage with. A lot of the Vincels, so to speak, have their own personal like appreciation for that kind of style. And I think for somebody who doesn't have like the natural inclination to just dive into the social aspect and do all the networking stuff after they've just produced a broadcast, product, and maybe they just want to go home and like be, keep to themselves, so to speak, when they're not on the job. That speaks to a different crowd, and maybe there is like a lot of natural deficiencies or disadvantages that come with that. But I wanted to ask you a little bit about how that's manifested in life, because when I've seen you try all these different hobbies that you have, right? You've got like the bass guitar, you've got music in general that you'll like listen to, like you do covers of metal music and stuff, and you have the you do the football and whatnot, like the Football Manager streams and all that stuff that I've seen from time and time again. You almost like find a way to present your hobbies in a way that's like, oh yeah, you can just come and hang out, and it's not the same thing. There's no conceit like, oh, this is like a broadcast, this is something that's buttoned up. It's just you hanging out, talking shit with the chat, and going from there. One of the things that I've noticed is that when people are sort of broadcast talent or any sort of have any sort of role in a larger piece, they're tried to be, they get people trying to pigeonhole them, and they say, oh, you're a broadcast talent, you're a caster. But it's not like you walk around with that label, proudly displayed at all times, right? That this is something that we're sort of getting to at the essence of this question is you just seem to pursue all the things that you enjoy without necessarily worrying about how you come off or whether or not it like fits the algorithm of YouTube. If I put a bass guitar video up and then a Football Manager video up, and then like there's not really a concern to turn that into work or turn that into something else. It's just you. So can you speak to what drives you to do what you're doing when you're not on the in the caster booth broadcasting to all those people? What do you really like out of the streaming, for example, or out of all the other hobbies that you do?
I think for me, it's just a case of life is too short, so you might as well do something that makes you happy. And that for me is the meaning of life in a nutshell, is to be happy, to pursue things that give you enjoyment. I find I think if I made my stream like a package and like a proper production, it would lose a part of its appeal to me. It would become almost like a job at that point, and it would become super professional. And I get enough of that while casting. I don't need to incorporate that in my stream as well. After casting, I pretty much need to decompress. I know some people decompress by going out socially and having some drinks and some beers and, going to a club or whatever. But for me, it's just like relax, like go back to my hotel room, chill out, listen to some music, play some games, like just proper full on chill. It's very tiring for me. It's exhausting mentally for me to commentate. Like if I do 2 best of 3s afterwards, I just need to not think about anything at all. So yeah, I think there is a definitely an effort, not one that I've ever thought of. So it's very interesting that you put it that way. But there is an effort to just hang out with chat, because for the most important thing for me while streaming is that community element. Like I streamed to like 3 people for about 5 years before I started to become known in CS. And I got like this core audience of maybe 50 people that we all knew each other really well. We all played games together. Like that was the appeal of streaming to me. And it still is. I don't know if I'd ever want to be a big streamer. I don't know if I'd ever want thousands and thousands of viewers, because then it would lose that little kind of intricate feel that it currently has. Getting to know people and being there through their hard times, but also their good times. That's really, really important to me. So yeah, I mean, if it ever got to a point where casting completely dried up and I needed that primary source of income, maybe I would have to look at streaming more as like an actual job and a career, rather than a bit of a hobby that brings in, some money now and again. But for the time being, I have casting. So streaming for me is just proper chill time. I'll be playing games anyway, so I may as well share that with my community and just hang out together.
As we're sort of wrapping up the interview here, I got a couple of sort of maybe rapid fire questions. And the first one is, I just want to know what your most memorable casting moments are so far. And, we touched on one of them at the beginning. I'm sure you had mentioned the man, the myth, the beast. Are there any others or anything you want to speak to specifically on some of the stuff that we've already covered in this interview that like you can go a little bit deeper and talk to me about why that in particular sticks out?
I think the most memorable is one we already touched on, which was the Moses thing. Mm-hmm. It wasn't necessarily like casting, I suppose. It was more just the experience. But I'd also say the most memorable, just as an all-around package, was from the Katowice Major, which was the ENCE Liquid match in the quarterfinals when ENCE actually upset Liquid. And it was this really cool storyline, like this team that no one expected to even make the last stages. They took down Liquid, one of the favorites. Some even had them penciled in to win the whole major. Casting that game, quarterfinals in front of that crowd, just going absolutely crazy, that will always stick out to me. And one of the really cool aspects actually is that I had people like Natu and some prominent Finnish figures reach out to me as well, Finn, and say like that you really made that a very special moment for us. Your casting was so genuine, and like you were really enveloped in all the enthusiasm of how important it was. And so I came away from that thinking I did that justice, and I was really sort of happy. I was just content. Like I just sat there for a couple of hours afterwards. I just thought I just witnessed something really special. Like that's going to stick with me for a very, very long time. So I think casting wise, it wasn't one of the big taglines. I don't think there had been any moment in that game that people will go back to in terms of a play and say like that was the moment that I remember your casting for. It was the overall package, like the fact I got to do a playoff match in front of a crowd at the major, and it happened to be this incredible, like crazy upset with sat alongside like a really good friend in Jason. Just the whole thing was very, very special to me.
And I want to close on asking you a little bit about your plans going forward for both CS and for Valorant, and maybe any other games that you might be dipping your toes into as far as broadcast talent. But also, if you want to roll in maybe some plans that you have for the stream, some more hangout games that you might be doing, anything like that that you think would be interesting to give a little bit of a sneak peek on in terms of what the viewers can expect.
Yeah, it's with COVID, the whole casting situation is a mess, isn't it? They just announced the major in Stockholm later this year. I'd love to be a part of that, although I don't think it's necessarily too likely. That's something I'll be aiming towards. I just want to get back out to LANs again, man. Like I'm just craving some LANs. I'm enjoying online casting. I think I'm one of the few casters that actually does have fun casting online. But I really want to get back to LANs. In terms of the stream, I'm just going to keep it the same, man. I don't really have too many plans. You know, it's as you said, it's more of a case of just hanging out with the chat. I'll keep playing CS. I'm trying to make a CS team at the moment. I'm playing League of Legends, which probably not good for my health, if I'm being honest. It's such a bad game. It really is. But I'm trying to stream that a little bit more, and then we'll take it each day at a time, man.
All right. Thanks very much for joining me, man, and best of luck in your future ventures.
Thanks a lot.